Hi, you're listening to Crime Tapes. Now, you might think, where's James? Well, he is still here. However, I will be taking the lead on this today, which is quite daunting for me, because it is International Women's Day, and we've got international women here. When I say international, basically from the School of Law, Policing and Forensics, to talk about women in crime. Today we have with us Jo Turner.
Hi.
We have Laura Walton-Williams.
Hello.
And also we have...
Hello, I'm James Treadwell, and I'm not a woman, so I'm going to be sitting back. I will talk a little bit, but largely sitting back today and saying less, because I think that's a good thing.
Possibly. But I'm not too sure how it's going to work, because let's face it, you do not know how to shut up, do you? Like most of the time. So this episode, we're going to be focusing on the perception of women in crime. Now, this is quite a tricky one to tackle. Women are just as capable of robbery, rape and murder as men. However, do they get the same? Are they treated the same in this justice system? Are they treated the same in the media? Or is this seen as a bit of an anomaly? So before we get into the cases, shall we say a little bit about ourselves today?
Hi, so I'm Jo Turner. I've appeared on one of these crime tapes before, but today, so I'm an Associate Professor of Criminology here at Staffordshire University. I have a particular interest in female offending. I've done quite a lot of work on female offending in the past, but obviously I know a lot about female offending in the contemporary picture.
Hi, I'm Dr. Laura Walton-Williams. I'm from a slightly different background to everybody else in that I'm a forensic biologist, but the majority of my research looks at sexual offences, obviously both females as victims but also perpetrators in sexual offence cases, and I'm really interested in inequality and power dynamics and how that influences sexual offence cases. So that's kind of my background.
Right, so we're going to look at a couple of cases today to frame this debate around, and the first one we're going to look at is Myra Hindley. Obviously, most people will know who Myra Hindley is, but for those that don't know, Jo, do you fancy telling us a little bit about Myra?
Okay, yeah, sure, Kyla. So I'll just give you a little bit of background about the Myra Hindley case. So she is really one of the most infamous women in British crime history. So, she was an English serial killer. She was officially convicted of the murders of Leslie Ann Downey, Edward Evans and John Kilbride in 1966. And between her and her partner in crime, Ian Brady, they're thought to have killed at least 5 children between the ages of 10 and 17. So Myra Hindley was born in 1942 in Manchester in England, and she lived with her regularly abusive father until her sister was born in 1946, at which point Myra went to live with her grandmother, who provided a fairly relatively normal childhood as far as we know. In 1961, Myra was 18 years old, and she began working then as a chemical distributing firm in Manchester. And that's where she met and obviously fell in love with Ian Brady, who was a stock clerk and who was recently released from prison. So after a year, the couple began a relationship and lived together at Myra's grandmother's house. It was Brady that introduced Myra to his obsession with Nazi philosophy and atrocities, and they shared really quite perverse interests with each other. Soon Brady discussed his want to commit the perfect murder. Brady came up with plans of rape and murder, and in July 1963 they took their first victim, Pauline Reed. Just a few months later, 12-year-old John Kilbride disappeared. In June 1964, 12-year-old Keith Bennett went missing, and on Boxing Day 1964, 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey went missing from a local fairground. The fate of these children was that Brady Hindley would take them to the local moors, where Brady would sexually assault them and then kill them by cutting their throat or strangulation. 3 of the victims were uncovered in graves on Saddleworth Moor, and Bennett's body is also thought to be on the moor, but after many searches, it still, to this day, hasn't been found. The duo's crimes were uncovered in October 1965, when David Smith, Hindley's 17-year-old brother-in-law, had been present when Brady killed 17-year-old Edward Evans with an axe. Smith avoided a similar fate by concealing his horror. Smith went to the police and told them what he'd seen, and that he'd been told there were more bodies on Saddleworth Moor. It was on April 27, 1966, that Hindley and Brady were brought to trial, where they pleaded not guilty. This was the first time that somebody had been convicted of murder after the penalty for murder, the capital punishment, had been suspended in 1965. So Brady and Hindley were sentenced to whole life tariffs, which was the sentence that had been put in place instead of capital punishment. So that meant whole life, as in the whole of the rest of their lives. Hindley's participation in the abductions, sexual assault and murder of the victims was always uncertain, though it appeared that she would pick the victims for Brady, stating that she was not involved in the murder, though Brady claimed that Myra helped cut the throat of the first victim, Reed. And a tape that was made of Leslie Ann Downey's assault confirmed that Hindley was definitely present during that time. So Hindley professed her innocence and cut ties with Brady in 1970 and spent her life campaigning to be freed. This received a great amount of media coverage until her confession and then her death in 2002. What's interesting to note here is that Brady never asked to be freed, and in fact had said that he would have preferred to have faced the death penalty than spend his whole life in prison. But Hindley did ask to be freed, and she, by all accounts, became quite a reformed character in prison. So from the word go, Hindley was a massively controversial character in the media. So she was described as evil, calculating, monstrous. She was the female personification of evil. However, the perception of her was also that she was an accomplice rather than an instigator. Even now, if you Google the crime, you'll find things along the lines of Brady was testing Hindley's blind allegiance and that he alone hatched plans of rape and murder. There's a lot to unpick with how the media portrayed Myra Hindley, who we could arguably say is probably the most famous female serial killer from the UK. So the portrayal of Myra Hindley in the media and the shock at women like Myra committing such violent crimes brings us on to many interesting questions. Questions like, for example, why does it seem that women commit far less crime than men? Does the punishment fit the crime and reflect that they're women? How does the treatment of women in the prison system, for example, differ to that of men? We're going to discuss and unpick some of these questions today.
Right, so with those questions in mind then, we often seem to hear of sort of distance travelled, of a criminal justice system that has improved immeasurably in its treatment and recognition of women, of far greater equity, equality, fairness, but in all sorts of walks of life, in all sorts of realms, that really isn't necessarily the case, is it? We still have lots and lots of different places whereby essentially the perception remains that the criminal justice system is largely, it involves in the agencies a very sort of masculine culture of investigation, capture and punishment, largely run by, disproportionately staffed by men, and then the follow-up to that being essentially the responses being to the typical man. Would you say that that is the case with the criminal justice system today? Where are we in terms of equity and equality?
Well, in terms of professionals within the criminal justice system, it was the 1919 Sex Removal Disqualification Act that allowed women to start being, judges, solicitors, magistrates, for example. And it's actually taken at least 100 years to get that equality. And I'd argue that we're still not there now. So the vast majority of police officers are male, vast majority of prison officers are male. We have now, from 2015, got equal numbers of men and women sitting as magistrates, and for that, it took nearly 100 years to get to that equal position. But if that's at the magistrate level. But if we look at judges and we look at High Court judges and so on, it's very much male dominated.
And I think it relates to kind of our perceptions of what crime is, and therefore it's some sort of violent act, and therefore there must be some sort of physical, if you're looking at a prison officer or a police officer role, then there must be some sort of physical ability to be able to stand up to that person. Whereas I think if you look at kind of how crimes are going to be perpetrated, there's always going to be very kind of violent crimes, but there's also other types of crimes that don't necessarily require that kind of traditional masculine.
Do you know, conversely,
response.
the probation service is more and more feminist,
Yeah,
and
it
because of that, the pay and whatnot has become very poor, because whenever any sort of industry becomes feminised, the wages drop,
And
they've got a bit of a problem getting male probation staff now, because they just don't want to work for the crap money and all the emotional labour.
And do you think that's because there's this kind of traditional view that they're caring persona and therefore they're going to support them and kind of rehabilitate them, whereas
and also women don't need as much money because they just have these little jobs to pay for their gym membership, surely, and their children's new shoes. That's they don't need it.
But we spoke about it earlier, didn't we, about the concept of how female criminals are described in the media. So the language that's used, and to make them sound very cold and icy. And I think, Carla, you mentioned about they're either either desexualised or hypersexualised. Yeah.
It's either the femininity is taken from them, or they are. If you look at the case of the Claudia Patatas lady who was in the news not long ago for being a neo-Nazi. If you read up what they say about her, it was like she was sleeping with her partner within a week, and it was all hypersexualised, because I think there's that link. If you look back at the Nazi exploitation stuff of the 40s, there's certain crimes that women are hypersexualised in, and that's one of them.
Well, Jo mentioned when she was talking about Myra and the kind of language that was used, like evil, in the media, and that reminded me of the case, the Michelle Carter case in America, where she was convicted of manslaughter by encouraging her boyfriend at the time, who was 17 years old, to commit suicide, and she was sending him text messages. But I think even in the newspaper she's described as like icy, and they kind of dehumanise them. So because I think that they struggle to have this concept of somebody who is female has the capabilities or the drive or the motivation to do that.
Yeah, and I think it's also that juxtaposition with the caring role that women are supposed to have. So it's seen that women are feminine, they're very much in caring roles, and so it's that sort of they've offended they've not only broken the criminal law, but they've broken that gender law. So you see that a lot in sexual offence cases, where if there's a female perpetrator, so paedophilia, for example, I think most people, when they think of like paedophile rings and stuff like that, it's always a man kind of, and if a woman is involved in very much similar ways to what we discussed earlier about they were coerced into taking part into it, and so the newspaper headlines when you've got a female paedophile are just people cannot get their head around it.
And those offenders are then represented in a way that's very different to the norm. So the one with paedophilia I always think about is the nursery worker, Vanessa George, and she was very much then sort of presented as being, if you read all of the sort of media stories about her, Vanessa George, essentially she worked in a nursery. She was at the time, the offences were committed against very, very young children that were in the nursery, and she again was involved with a male and another female.
Because I used to work in a nursery, and after all this came out, we went through. You won't be able to go into any nursery now and work with a mobile phone. You cannot have your mobile phone. They have to be locked in a drawer when you walk in, and that is directly from this case. Yeah,
but they essentially, in some ways, George was one of the less complicit, wasn't she? Because she was sort of sending pictures to the male involved, hence the phone thing. But the thing that's interesting in some ways about that is that they very much sort of represented her as the sort of ugly woman who couldn't form loving bonds. It was sort of to describe as sort of outside of that typical woman. In some ways that contrasts with Hindley as this sort of hyper-sexualised woman. But you could make the argument that in some ways that women's treatment therefore by the media is on one hand very stereotypical and so on. But against all of this as a backdrop, when we move to look at women's involvement in the criminal justice system, and purely involvement in the criminal justice system, they're in no way, shape or form involved in the process, as it were, as much as men. And that leads to debates about, do women commit as much crime as men? What are your thoughts on that, Jo?
Well, I was going to say, what we do know for absolutely definite is that we've got far, far less women that enter the criminal justice system. That doesn't necessarily mean women are committing less crime. It means less
They might
crime.
be better at it.
Yeah, well, they're just not being
reported.
detected.
Yeah.
So there are different theories about this. So it might be that women are committing less crime because what we could argue is that women generally have been kept in the domestic sphere, so away from the public life. So their opportunity to commit certain types of crime is reduced compared to men. So, I mean, it's a relatively well-known fact that perpetrators of crime tend to be young male people, and victims of crime tend to be young male people. And that's essentially because they're out in the public sphere in those areas, those situations where crime might happen. But don't forget, we're talking about a very specific type of crime. So if we look at online fraud, that could be a man or a woman. We don't know who they are, and that they've equally got access to those sorts of crimes. When we think about crimes like infanticide and prostitution, that's predominantly women that are prosecuted for those crimes. So women are prosecuted for certain crimes, and it probably is the case that they're committing less crime, but we don't know for certain because we only know about what crimes people are prosecuted for. But this is true throughout history. We can go right back to medieval times and look at any court records, and we know that it's always men that are there in the court records compared to women. You've only got to walk into a magistrate's court now, and the fact that you can go through the whole day in a remand court and you've only ever seen male
And
offenders.
it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because in some ways, perhaps then it reflects the fact that most policing and most criminal justice is criminal justice for the public rather than the private realm. It's dealing with those things that happen in public. But then increasingly, I suppose, as it is International Women's Day, as those sort of traditional gender-based stereotypes about the woman's place is in the home, that there is women's work and men's work, that the man is the breadwinner. As those things fall away, is there the possibility that we'll see a change, or have seen a change in that over time?
So if you take what I've just said as an explanation for why you've got more men rather than women in the criminal justice system, you would expect, as you've got more and more women going out to work, more and more women take an active part in public life, that you would get a rise in the number of women being prosecuted for crimes, and we don't see that. So then, is there something about a feminine nature that means...
Or maybe they just don't have any time.
It might be. I just don't have the time. Absolutely.
Somebody who ran down here to 9 to 5 Dolly Parton as an intro in the car going past me. It's like, maybe we don't have time.
Well, it kind of, again, I'm going to relate it back to sexual offences because that's what I know the most about. But they have kind of said that there's lots of underrepresented groups when it comes to reporting sexual offences, but actually kind of middle class women of a certain age won't report them because they'll see it as a minor inconvenience in their very busy day. So actually we kind of almost might have a slightly skewed view of who kind of traditional victims are, based on the importance that somebody puts on what sort of crime that they might come forward. So again, in domestic violence settings, there's often sexual violence associated with that, but they don't report the sexual violence because to them that's just something that they have to get through to survive, and that's not the greatest threat on them. So we might not necessarily see a correct picture of what the crimes are, because it's a prioritisation of actually what is the most important thing to my survival, and that's not it.
Because I've just said about, these are the crimes that we know about because these are the crimes that people get convicted of, but in fact there is that earlier stage, what actually even gets reported, let alone prosecuted. So there is a lot going on that we just don't know about.
And there must be something into that as well, about that investigation as well. And I guess this is where I turn to Laura a little bit more, because as we were saying, at the sort of front end of the criminal justice system and the criminal justice process, those roles, particularly if you think about sort of the investigation, the prosecution, they're regarded as, in some ways, as being sort of scientific, as being about analysis, about being able to be sort of detached and considered, and traditionally, in some ways, it's exactly those roles that have been the preserve of men. They're very sort of male dominated, whether we're talking about the sort of forensic science side of investigation or simply criminal investigation. There's a very sort of male ethos that can underpin some of that, isn't there? I mean, is that something you found as someone who teaches essentially forensic science of crime investigation?
And I think the point that Joe made earlier about kind of the view that there's a lot more male frontline police officers, and we see that reflected in our students coming through. Forensic science is actually the opposite. It tends to be very female orientated and female dominated, so we tend to see more students coming in. And
is that something that's shifted over time, or has it been? That largely been?
Yeah, definitely, because historically everything was male dominated. So even if women were doing the work, then they weren't necessarily getting the credit or the headlines for it. But I think now with kind of initiatives to try and get women in STEM and things like that, we're seeing much more of that. I think what we'll probably see a shift in now in the kind of change in focus of policing, dealing with mental health issues, and with them recognising that things like family liaison officers are really important roles, and kind of not just your kind of Bobby on the beat, but there's so many nuanced roles. So we have like specialised sexual violence officers. So I think, and you'd hope that you'll see a bit more kind of balance of genders across the criminal justice system. But again, I go into firearms units, and it will be invariably men in those units. So we are still a long way off that kind of concept that everybody views those roles available for everybody.
And I suppose that could have an impact in terms of, so if traditionally and historically essentially investigation's been the preserve of men, that has an impact in some ways on the sort of schema that they use when sort of sorting out what people are doing. So, for example, when they encounter females, they will tend to see, the vulnerable female in need of protection is, sort of something that's could be in the mindset there.
Okay. So where I've talked about, one of the ways that we could think about the fact that there are less women in the criminal justice system is basically because possibly women commit less crime, or it is that they're better at committing it so they don't get caught. But it also could be a matter of
hiding in plain sight sort of thing.
Or even, where we think about diverting people out of the criminal justice system. So historically, young women that have found themselves in trouble, rather than prosecuting them, there's more of a welfare approach towards them to keep them out of the criminal justice system. So whereas a boy might have been taken through that system, the girl wouldn't have been. So historically, we've almost proved that. Pam Cox, from one of the leading scholars within that, looking at that sort of thing.
So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, really.
It's an interesting one coming back to Myra Hindley, isn't it? Because there's, in some ways, the thing for Hindley is she is there to be able to use this sort of defence of led astray by the bad boy, which we see an awful lot in those.
I was going to say, but that
cases.
sort of then denies female agency, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, because that might be a narrative that she put forward as a defence. It might be a narrative that was put forward by the media since then. And, it's possible that the total opposite is true and that she was the instigator. What we don't know. We can't prove. We can't prove. One thing we do know is that Myra Hindley was the one that was going out selecting the people to be picked up. So she was definitely playing an active part, even if she didn't go ahead and commit the actual murder herself. It's a joint enterprise, really, isn't it? She's part of that, and she knows what the fate of those victims is going to be. So there's an agency there that we can't deny.
Was it either her or Rose West who were basically playing on the fact that they were a trustworthy woman and therefore could entice people to get into the cars, and so they're almost playing up to the gender stereotypes to use that to enable them to commission their crimes.
Well, that brings us nicely on to Rose West, because I think Rose West is a good one to sort of counteract Hindley with. West was doing that sort of tempt the victim in, and indeed West sort of, although perhaps less well known than Hindley as a figure when we talk about British serial killers. And there's something interesting, isn't there, in the way that even sort of violent female offenders are thought about. So people may know sort of West and Hindley, but they might not have heard, for example, of Beverly Allitt, who was one of the few sort of female serial killers I can think of who acted alone, hers in a healthcare role where she was a nurse targeting young children.
Yeah, but she was actually a paediatric nurse, wasn't she?
Yeah, absolutely. But Kyla, the case of Rose West is a really, really interesting one, isn't it? Could you tell us a bit about how that contrasts perhaps with Hindley?
Yeah, actually, we actually discussed the West in the module that I've just ran, the Anthropology of Evil. One of the things that we looked at with the West is the fact that Rose, they got together when she was only 15 years of age. There was a hell of a lot of abuse in Rose's life. She went on to abuse with Fred. She actually killed his daughter, his stepdaughter, while he was in prison, and he came back to burn the body because she just couldn't handle having children to look after. So yeah, she's a really, really interesting case. She was portrayed in the media as the one that was kind of following along with Fred, but if you have seen any sort of interviews with Fred West, he's not the brightest tool. He wasn't the brightest tool in the box. You see that possibly maybe that was a wrong analogy. Maybe it wasn't him that was the driving force there. Although she was so very young, she was very, very young when they got together, I wouldn't say that she was a complete victim, even though she was a victim of abuse. That cycle kept going, but she had her own mind on that one, definitely. So, bit of background on Rose and Fred. They were basically over the course from the 70s right up until it was in the 1990s when he was arrested, but they'd basically been systematically killing people, well, mainly young women and children, some of which were related to them, having a daughter, and burying their bodies in old properties that they used to live at. They lived is what is now known as the House of Horrors, where many of the victims were found, and there was also some victims found on some wasteland as well. But they think that they didn't actually get all the victims, and there could be a lot more young women out there that were murdered and raped by the Wests.
Essentially their modus was to pick up young women quite often, wasn't it? The women that they encountered. But at least in part
13-year-old daughter as well, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. And at least in part of that was that Rose would use the fact that she was a similar age to the victim to send out this sort of message of safety. So they picked people up who were hitchhiking, for example, and Fred on his own would have come across as the sort of consummate weirdo and creep, but having his young attractive wife Rose with him could say, look,
some credibility.
It gave him the credibility. So and they were they really became sort of infamous British serial killers. But as you say, there's quite a difference in that one. In the first instance, Fred was regarded as being the devil incarnate, the sort of the bad man who sat atop of this sort of with his perverse pleasures and so on. But actually, as the case unfolded, it became apparent that at least one of the murders that they were jointly implicated in, he couldn't have committed because he was in prison custody. So it's a complex one. It challenges some of those notions about how women act and their role, perhaps, as followers.
And I think a couple of things that have been pointed out in both of these two cases about the previous experiences in childhood and abuse that they've potentially experienced. And some of the research indicates that 53% of women in prison report having experienced emotional, physical or sexual abuse during childhood. And 31% of women in prison have spent time in local authority care as a child. And that's not obviously excusing anything, but you kind of see that they're entering this kind of cycle of violence and thinking it's a normalised behaviour. And I think that then becomes how they're portrayed as like evil, because that's the world that they've come from, and I think to some degree that is why the media does it, is because it makes us feel better that we're not the same as them, because we're not from that same environment.
It sells. If they were to write a piece about troubled woman goes and commits crime, that's not going to sell newspapers. They need that hook in an evil, monstrous, vile is what hooks the reader.
And I think, like, we're talking about kind of like obviously women in prison, but also the reasons that they've ended up in prison are not necessarily always the same, or the circumstances that have led them to end up in prison are not always the same. And I think you, Jo, you were going to talk a little bit about kind of prison environments.
I was going to say, I mean, you know, we know that there's only women only make up to about 5% of the overall prison population in the UK. So if you think that we've got I can't remember the exact figure.
86,000.
Yeah,
roughly,
something like that, with a capacity of about 89,000. So we're always very near to capacity anyway. So women only make up about nearly 4,000 of that figure. So it's a really, really small figure. And most women are in prison for sentences of less than 12 months, so short prison sentences. Not many women in prisons. They invariably are in prison for low-level offending, but repeated low-level offending. So it becomes serious because it's repeated.
Well, that's a really interesting point in some ways, isn't it? Because if you think about the cases that become synonymous with the female offender, we've talked about Myra Hindley and Rose West, which would be the ones that the public sort of see. You know, these are the way that we highlight women's criminality. Yeah. It's almost
absolutely not
totally the polar opposite of what most women are in prison custody for. So you see that yourself, Jo. I'm sure going through with them coming through the courts.
Yeah, I was going to say, so shoplifting, theft of any kind, and usually, well, not usually, but quite often that can be used to fuel addictions that they might have. I mean, that's the same for men as well, but particularly so for women. Women traditionally, if there's any sort of major theft or robbery going on, women don't necessarily take part in the active part of it, but they will be the ones that handle the stolen goods. They will be the ones that, you know, if there's a family enterprise going on, it's perhaps the men going out to do the active part, but it's the women doing the business side of things.
That's interesting.
That's where they get,
the brains behind the operation provided by the women.
I mean, even going back in time, you know, the pawnbroker, you know, women were the ones that were stealing something and then pawning it and using that money. So,
and I think that kind of ties into almost the crimes of necessity, and kind of again linking in with the poverty aspect is that it's more acceptable that a woman will come in and you know, want to exchange this for cash. It's not because she's a criminal, it's because she needs that money.
I mean, if you think about drug smuggling, if you're going to try and get drugs across borders, you're not going to use a bloke. No. You're going to use a woman with children in tow, for example, because far less likely to be stopped.
But of course, if they are then stopped disproportionately, that can have a huge impact on them. And it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because again, it's sort of framing our thinking around how these things play out necessarily. As you were saying, this, you know, the women's role is often not quite so much the active part. But how do we necessarily know that as well? Because there's also the interesting thing that a lot of women, when they are involved in that sort of criminal offending, are essentially in a situation where they're with a male partner who is jointly involved in that enterprise. So there's a lot of discussion about women's involvement in being kind of coerced into crime. But then the question becomes, how do we necessarily know where that coercion plays out, and how do we make those judgment calls, or do they just reflect
I was going to say, I think
our attitudes towards gender?
I think absolutely. So it's the stereotypes, isn't it? That's what we're assuming. But I mean, you know, I'm all one for acknowledging women's agency and women's agency in normal everyday life. You know, we've got some really successful, intelligent, high-powered women, and 4 of them are sitting in this room today, and only one man. But also, women do commit crime. You know, and we shouldn't shy away from that fact. Where the difference arises is what type of crime. So, you know, we talked about we've got fewer women coming to the courts prosecuted of crime. So if for example, it's the men out doing the robberies and it's the women handling the stolen goods, it's far harder to detect that handling the stolen goods than it is the active robbery part. So I'm just using that as an example, but so then we can see why we might have, if we've got, you know, say 3 women doing the handling of stolen goods and 3 men going out and doing the robberies, we might have the 3 men being caught and prosecuted for the robberies. We're not getting those 3 women. It isn't that there are fewer women committing the crime, it's just that they're committing different sorts of crimes.
But there is perhaps something still there, though, isn't there? Which is that in terms of the violent offences, for the most part, those do tend to be the preserve of men. And yet, when we think about that representation of women's offending, the sort of dominant press representation is very much of the atypical violent woman, isn't it, Kyla? It's that sort of, we want to show a particularly sort of bad, dangerous and difficult side to women. Why do you think that is?
I think because we live in such a sort of male-dominated environment, if a man was to, if we take domestic violence, right? Women don't you don't think of a woman as a perpetrator of domestic violence. Women can hit their partners, can coercively control them, they can do all those things, but we always see us as the victims. Now, as a woman being a violent criminal, entering that system, that also sort of plays on their masculinity, especially if a woman's, say for example, you get a mob boss who gets attacked by a woman, and then he has to go to his peers and say, well, it was a woman who did this to me. So obviously you've got to look at, are we just putting on to the women that, no, you can't be this person, you can't be violent, because if you're violent, then it somehow affronts my own masculinity. You've bettered me, I can't have this. Is this why men don't talk about violent crime in the household? Will they not go to their... I could sit and talk to you girls now and say, this was what happened to me, my husband did this, he didn't, by the way, let's get that out there. And I wouldn't feel judged. However, would you feel the same going down to the pub and say, my wife just hit me, and it's like, what? She's 5'2". James, you're a big lad. Don't be ridiculous. There's that still there.
Yeah, the gender stereotyping and the use of language and everything like that it massively plays into kind of how comfortable people feel about discussing the victimisation and kind of commissioning of crime.
And that gender stereotyping still has a pretty damaging impact at times, doesn't it? Especially when tied to other things. So I'm thinking that, today, International Women's Day, just a short time ago, we had the sort of the Manchester report on the abuse of young females published, and in particular, the sort of thing that comes out of that is that it's the girls who aren't being acceptable girls that we can overlook the victimisation of, because there's a couple of minutes of sort of outrage almost. It gets a little bit of press attention, but we didn't see hashtags sustaining that movement like we did around Me Too, for example. So
I think sometimes it's about being the right sort of victim and the right sort of perpetrator. And if you ask somebody about somebody wwho perpetrates sexual offences, they'll say, some like an old man in a flasher Mac type thing, and you're like, well, actually, no, that's not the majority of people that perpetrate those sorts of offences. And I think we've spoken about this before in relation of, it's almost like self-protection. If I can't identify as either the victim or the perpetrator, then I'm okay. There was a case where a young girl was killed, and they're focusing, and Kyla mentioned this earlier about hypersexualisation, and saying, oh well, she was quite into strangulation in bed, and that's why and it's almost like it makes us feel better, or it makes us feel safer that we're not going to be that victim, or we're not going to be that perpetrator, because we don't have those same characteristics. And I think that's why a lot of these things happen, and that's why the media headlines are as they are, because it means that we can accept, we can watch programmes about this and not be seen as weird. We're doing it because we just want to learn a little bit more, but it's not the same as that sort of thing happening to us, because that sort of thing wouldn't happen to me.
Yeah, and I think that's probably true across both genders in some ways, but I think it's an interesting one, isn't it? Sort of particularly where the impact is felt in the way that dominant ideals sort of shape both the sort of the limits and the excesses of how people are able to behave. But I guess again, sort of focusing in on the fact that it is International Women's Day and so on, it's interesting. It still takes attention away from some other areas. And we sort of started off with by talking about the path travelled more generally. And again, I think that's true of the UK. But I remember reading just a few days ago that, and this is the specific headline, that 22 men in the world own more wealth than every woman in Africa. So you can kind of think of the distance travelled. But actually, when it comes to gender equality on a global scale.
Oh, and when you were talking earlier, and you said, in some respects, yes, we've come a long way, but there's a long way yet to go. In every aspect of whether it's being the victim or whether it's how perpetrators are treated, and we kind of had a look at women's prisons, and basically there are 12 prisons in England for women. There are no prisons in Wales. There's one women's prison in Scotland. And then in Northern Ireland they're held in a male young offenders institute, and you kind of think about how that would then influence their rehabilitation, and the impact it has on them and their families and everything like that, and their access to any sort of support network is a massive issue.
Yeah, I mean that's a major problem for any woman that goes to prison. So essentially, because there are so few women that need to go to prison, we have so few prisons. So a female prison will hold women that are in there for shoplifting and women that are in there for murder. So you've got the whole gamut, really, of the offence.
And typically around about 100 miles away from the area that they're resident in, which means much tougher for people to visit, to maintain those family contacts.
Yeah, and particularly with children, because it is pretty much acknowledged that, the main caregivers tend to be the women, the mothers. So if you've got women, single parent, so mums that haven't particularly got a lot of support and they go to prison, then the children go into foster care, and the woman's then put into a prison that is miles away from anywhere. Those children are just not going to be able to visit. You got women then coming out of prison, and they find that they've got nowhere to live, so it's then more difficult for them to get the children back from foster care, whereas if a man goes to prison, invariably there's a female member of the family somewhere, if not the mother, that is going to be looking after the children. I mean, and that's not to suggest that it isn't also a problem for men to maintain contact with the children, because obviously it still is, but I think it is acknowledged that because there are so few women's prisons that is a bigger. And I think the other point about women's prisons is, if you take the example of, let's say, a 30-year-old man that gets sentenced to, let's say, 10 years in prison, and he serves 8 years, so he might not have had children before he went to prison, and he comes out of prison and he can still have children, You take a 30-year-old woman that hasn't had children, you put her in prison for 10 years, when she serves, let's say, she serves 8, she comes out, she might have missed the whole of her childbearing. So when we think about the human right of a right to a family, we could be thinking about, the breach of a woman's human rights when we're sentencing.
That's a greater impact.
That's right, it's the impact. So some of these things can have a massive impact on women because they're women.
Yeah, and so raising fundamental sort of questions about justice that we need to give more thought to.
We also need to think about the women that end up having to give birth in prison as well.
Absolutely.
There was a case not long ago where a baby died because a woman gave birth in a cell on her own, and that brings into some serious questions of what is actually happening. I
was just going to say, because prisons aren't hospitals, are they?
No,
so men and women, if they become ill, have to go to hospitals. But like you say, if a woman's pregnant and she's in prison, or she gives birth, then the implications are far greater for that woman, and men don't have that.
I've always thought, and I'm no abolitionist, I've always thought that the fundamental of prison should be to keep people incarcerated and thereby protect the public. But there is an argument that it's quite different. You can lock people up beyond the point at which you need to incapacitate them, and at 8.5 months pregnant, fleeing anywhere or anybody is going to be fairly difficult. in the same way that perhaps, you know, sometimes when we lock up the very elderly, we're going past the point at which it's sensible.
But we have to think about justice, though, and we have to think about the victims and the public seeing that justice is there.
Absolutely. So it's incredibly complex, isn't it?
I think it depends on the crime as well, though. You know, to the end of the day, when you think you're saying about justice, I mean, I'm one of these people that don't believe that people for non-violent crime should be locked up. I'm complete opposite.
Yeah, okay.
I'm sorry.
But then you've got a real problem. So if you've got somebody, let's say, that's been shoplifting, whether the male or the female, and they've had cautions, they've had conditional discharges, they've had fines, they've still stolen.
But if you're desperate and you need to feed yourself and that's your only course to do that, the fine's not going to help, is it? The fine's not going to stop me from shoplifting.
No, but then you can have community sentences that people don't.
There's always going to be a point at which, though, people will not comply. And what do you do with the non-compliant? If you
what do you do with them?
Every stage.
Yeah.
So I think it is. It is complex, and it opens up all sorts of questions about, you know, how the system should operate and how well it's operating. And in some ways, like I say, we've talked about a road perhaps well travelled, but an awful lot still to be done. But I'm really conscious that I don't want this to be about my voice. So as three female criminologists, crime experts, let me just ask you, if there was one sort of thing that you'd like to see done in the criminal justice system for the benefit of women, what would your sort of policy wish be?
Oh, that's really difficult. It's really difficult, even just to pick one. I think, for me, this actually goes for men as well as women. I think I would like to see, in particular for people that are committing crimes out of necessity or because of addictions, so more help before they get to that point.
I'd say that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
The money needs putting into preventative methods more than
that's
punitive.
Right.
It's prevention is better than cure.
Yeah.
Laura, yourself, because obviously your expertise, an area of expertise, is particularly around sexual offences and responding to that. Do you think, is there an area there where you think that there could be perhaps a great win or great improvement?
I think it's often harder in relation to sexual offences because often the situation is that the female is in the most cases a woman. So you don't necessarily have that. One thing, I suppose, from that perspective might be looking at restorative justice processes, because I think often sometimes the victim doesn't necessarily see that her voice is being heard or that processes are improving, and kind of what the priority put on those sorts of cases in relation, or I suppose the level of evidence, and I know some ongoing cases at the moment about outcomes in rape cases, so I don't want to talk too much about that, but it is sometimes about that kind of how trying to get more of those cases through prosecuted and having a positive outcome might have a bit more of a positive influence on people reporting those sorts of offences. But I do think things like restorative justice is quite an interesting area, but I also think about the kind of more from a general perspective, that rehabilitation post incarceration. And we've talked a little bit about kind of some of the struggles that if you are coming out of prison as a woman, what support networks are in place in order to be able to enable them to rehabilitate and not just end up being reoffending. And I think that might be something that would be really beneficial to look at.
So as we're wrapping up now this podcast, what I want to ask our guests essentially is, what would you like anyone listening to this to take away with them today? So I'll start with you, Jo. What is it that you think is the take-home message from today's podcast?
I think I have to say, really, I think it's all very complicated and not quite as simple, perhaps, even as we've represented here today. I think what I'd like to say is the vast majority of women that find themselves in trouble with the criminal justice system find themselves in prison. To reiterate this point, that they've quite often come from abusive backgrounds, so there's been some sort of abuse either in the childhood or within the domestic sphere as wives, as partners, that there's been an abusive background. That's not to say that everybody who's been abused goes on to commit crime, but there is, this underlying aspect to lots of women's stories where there's been some disadvantage, some abuse in the background, and that abuse might have become normalised. We look at Myra Hindley, we look at Rose West, we look at this new defence of coercive control. So abuse doesn't have to be physical abuse, it can be coercive control as well. So that there's an awful lot of that goes on. That I think that we have to acknowledge that women, whilst we can say they've got agency and should be punished for the crimes, but we have to recognise where those women are coming from. A lot of those women are coming from.
I think everybody that's convicted in the criminal courts has got a story, and we tend to sort of just homogenise just offenders, and we don't say that these are actually people. Especially, as academics, we need to start thinking this is not just offenders. It's not just this. These are actual people with actual lives.
I think probably on a similar ilk to that, it's I suppose the types of offences that are being committed and the types of sentences they're serving. So the vast majority of women's prison sentences are non-violent, so about 82%, and about 77% of prison sentences were for 12 months or less. But the fact that, that could have a disproportionate and kind of multiplying effect on their life afterwards. They might be committing what we would class as a kind of a minor offence, but they're probably then more likely to reoffend because of the implications of that prison sentence on their life post-offence. And whilst we'll see that that's similar for males and females, I do think that we've got to discuss some of the bigger challenges surrounding female prisoners.
I think that's what I was getting to with my whole deal with the prison system. So, yay. So, James, even though you weren't meant to be joining us properly on this, what would you like to...
Well, I think one of the things that comes out is just how much the experience in some ways, particularly for those who find themselves in the criminal justice system, is quite unified, actually. It's difficult, traumatised lives with backgrounds of abuse, addictions, a lot of it, poverty, a lot of it caused in some ways, by circumstances perhaps outside of the individual's control. And that takes me to the point about how we then perceive and sort of think about those things. And I think what's really interesting today is we've spent a lot of time talking about the sort of taken for granted assumptions that sort of inform the representation, particularly the media representation about how and why people act in such a way. And I think it's just to sort of strip that back and accept that, what is normal to one person is quite sort of can be quite different and varied for another, and it's just to sort of approach that representation with a questioning mind, not simply an acceptance. It's not true that all women are sort of powerless and incapable of having agency, but so too it's also not the case that all those who do bad things are necessarily evil witches. The truth lies in a complexity in the middle, perhaps somewhere, and it's about trying to again get back to that sort of recognition of the complexity of the individual, and not just the sort of tabloid heading. And in some ways, perhaps it shows us, as we've been saying a few times, it shows us some of the distance travelled that we're now perhaps starting to get to a point where there is a better recognition of some of that being articulated. But I think there is still an awfully long way to go. I'd concur with that, and I'm pretty sure that if tomorrow we were to wake up to headlines of a male and female being involved in a horrific crime, we'd see much the same things played out again. So change and no change, but it shouldn't end with me. So Kyla, I was just gonna get on that point what you've just said and say that bit of a shameless plug for one of the modules that we're running this year for level 4 students is media representation in society, where we're going to look at this and unpack it in the classroom environment and get the new crop of criminologists who are mainly women. I'm just going to get that out there. We've got a very, very female oriented cohort
and in law
and in law we are it's the future is starting right here. And we're going to look at that starting from this week, and hopefully they'll enjoy it.
That links to some of the things that we do with so any of our new applicants, they get invited to an offer holder day with us, and we look at the Hillsborough disaster, and we look at it in terms of demonisation of football, hooliganism in the media, and I think that the criminological aspects of that are really, really interesting, and how people perceive people that have been involved, even if they are the victims, and that kind of links really strongly to what you're talking about there.
I know somebody who has done research in that area that helped me with my PhD ethics. I could. What a great way to wrap up with a positive message about women's role at Staffordshire University and the changing nature of there's more of us than there is of you.
Absolutely, ever acutely aware of that. So all that it really remains for us to do today is to thank our guests, Joe and Laura, for joining us. You can find more about our podcast on Buzzsprout, I will say that correctly at some point, or through Spotify, where I found it was the other day. And you can also find out more about studying the wonderful courses like criminology, which are represented more by women now than by male students at Staffordshire University.
Although men are welcome.
Men are welcome, all are welcome. Anyone is welcome at Staffordshire University, and you can find out about us at staffs.ac.uk. And all it remains for me to say is goodbye, and to hand over to Kyla, our presenter.
Yeah, that's not happening again. So maybe next year. But yeah, I want to say goodbye and thank you all for being here in my new role as presenter. Unless I get used to it, and then we'll just.
In which case, you're better than me, yeah.
No. You like take to this like a duck to water, whereas I'm just like no. You got that smart, like that smooth game show hosting going on.
I think, Kyla, you need to own this as a woman. You need to say, I can do this as well as you.
I can do this as well as you.
I think she was better than me, but don't let that one out. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Okay, and bye.
Happy International Women's Day.
Yeah, absolutely. Bye.
Crime Tapes couldn't happen without the remarkable students and staff in the Staffordshire University School of Law, Policing and Forensics. Do you see yourself as a crime investigator, researcher, or even preventing crime and protecting the community on the front line in the police force? Whatever your future holds, a great education is the first step into making it a reality. Browse our courses at staffs.ac.uk and discover your potential.